My name is DJ Chuang, and I'm grateful to be alive and thankful for every breath that God gives and this opportunity to share with you. The title of my talk is Erasing Shame About Mental Health in Asian American Christian Communities. I'm Asian American and you're probably not, but we probably have a lot more in common than we have different. Some of you may be Asian American. Some of you know Asian Americans in your church or in your community, and some of you have no Asian Americans in your regular everyday life. But we're all in the same human condition, and as I share stories out of my own lived experience and a few descriptions of Asian Americans, my hope is that you will relate, and it may even give you new perspective of how you are going through this journey we call life together. Obviously, we have differences in terms of how we look, the amount of color in our skin, the food we eat, our history, our culture, and languages, but we have the same aspirations, that we desire to live a healthy and safe life. We desire to raise our families up with good values. We desire that they would follow God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we desire to have education and the things that would be meaningful in living out our faith in the world today. As Asian Americans, just give you a quick introduction so you have a sense of our unique context that's different than other types of Americans. Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial ethnic grouping, projected to double in size from 20 million in 2014 to 40 million in 2050. That's well within the lifetime of most of us. And yet Asian Americans are a very diverse group, over 34 languages and ethnicities, well over hundreds if you count very specific ethnicities. So as I describe what it's like to be Asian Americans and to address the issue of mental health in our communities, there are some general observations and they don't apply to every single Asian ethnicity or community or individual in the exact same way. So just keep that in mind. Now here's the kicker. Asian Americans are 3 times less likely to seek help for mental health than white Americans. 3 times less likely. And you know already, as we address this issue of mental health during this online pastors retreat, that it's already hard enough for those of you that are white Americans. Can you imagine making it 3 times harder? Now, in a little more context, in Asia, Japan and South Korea, wealthy countries, right? First world developed countries, they have the highest suicide rates in the world among developed countries. And there's different reasons for that, but it's such a sad and tragic situation that there is that kind of despair in our Asian heritage and culture. And I'll address some of those reasons in just a few minutes. Psychiatry and psychology is underdeveloped and undervalued in many, if not all, Asian cultures and ethnicities. Some cultures don't even have a word or language to describe mental illness. And I'm Chinese American, and one study has shown there are 133 words and phrases related to shame in the Chinese language. So shame is such a dominant framework and emotion that quelches our well-being as Asians and Asian Americans. Now, growing up in a traditional immigrant Chinese American family in Virginia, I thought my life was normal. and I didn't address or never had a personal encounter with mental illness or mental health. Sure, I might have studied it in health class in high school, but I don't remember any of it. And I even took some classes in college. I made it through school, high school, seminary, even the first 5 years of my work life after seminary as a pastor. And as long as I was functioning and doing decently well, I thought I was okay. But I had no idea that I could have used help much sooner. So it was when I had a personal crisis in the year of 2000, when I could no longer function, meaning I could not think clearly. I struggled to get out of bed. I struggled to just go from hour to hour, and I was in between jobs. And it was just so stressful and so overwhelming that I needed to get help, professional help. And I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And for the past 20 years, I've had to actively manage my self-care, my mental and emotional well-being, my health in all aspects of life, because I could use all the help I could get. Life is hard, but God is good. And as part of my own self-care, I've had to learn how to care for myself and understand mental health. It wasn't something I paid attention to, and I took it for granted. And now in hindsight, I have the perspective that if I had attended to my mental and emotional well-being sooner, I could have lived a better quality of life. I could have served others better and been more fruitful and effective in ministry, which is, I know, your heart as well. So why didn't I get help earlier? Well, I didn't think I had a problem. I was functioning fine. And the few reference points of people that I knew who were struggling with mental health were people that couldn't hold down a job. They tried to get medication, they tried to get counseling, but this person I'm thinking of would just want to get off that medication because it adversely affected him, and he couldn't hold down a job for more than three or 4 months. And then he would have these erratic mood swings, and you could tell when he was sad and just kind of out of it. And then times he would be very energetic and very creative. And that was my point of reference, real life example of bipolar disorder. And I didn't have those kind of symptoms, not even 20 years ago when I was really struggling myself. Growing up, I certainly had moments of sadness and emptiness that my friends and my brothers, I have 2 younger brothers, didn't seem to have. So maybe it was a problem with me, an attitude problem, or as I started walking with Christ, maybe it was just a spiritual problem. I needed to pray more and study the Bible more. But it was more than that. I needed more than that to really be healthy, which was addressing my mental health. I knew about the availability of counseling, but I was afraid and ashamed to get help because I didn't want to dishonor my family. That was a big factor. For one, I didn't want to admit my own weaknesses. I didn't think I had a problem. And then also, I didn't want to dishonor my family, what my mom and dad think. So when I really, really needed help, I have been married 25 years now, and my wife was supportive in getting help for me. But it took a while, I think a couple of years for me to or actually, no, not a while, but it took me a while for me to share with my parents that I had this diagnosis and that I was struggling. And, could I look into my family history? Was some of this hereditary or epigenetics? And, they denied it. There's nothing in my family history. And wish for me and my brother's wish for me was that I would get off of medication, because they just believed that medication was not a good thing for me to be stuck with for the rest of my life. So that was my family reaction. And growing up in a traditional Chinese family, we didn't know how to, or we didn't talk about emotions, so I didn't know how to talk about my emotions. I was out of touch with my feelings. I went to undergrad as an engineer. I went to a seminary that was very left brain and cognitive. And so I was out of touch with my feelings well into my 40s. And so it's only been during the past 20 years of caring for my mental health that I've learned to get in touch with both sides of my brains, both the thinking and feeling part, so that I could be a more whole person. And something in Asian culture, one last thing I'll mention, is how Asian cultures don't really have a concept of Sabbath. Asians know how to work hard and survive, very strong work ethic, and they've survived all kinds of difficult things throughout history, and that's just how we as Asians and Asian Americans live. We didn't have the luxury to be quote-unquote navel-gazing and examining how well we're doing emotionally or mentally, as we're speaking about here. Asian cultures are in this honor and shame framework where we value family and respect and purity and appearing properly, addressing people formally with titles. Actually, in the way we name one another, we start with the last name first. So family name first. My name in Chinese is Zhuan Di Fei. It's a family name first, family first, not the individual. And we honor our elders. Those of you that are older than me would appreciate that a lot more than our American culture that celebrates youthfulness and the energy of youth culture and how fast that turns. And get this, 2/3 of the world live in honor-shame cultures. So if we are to love God and His people around the world, we have to understand, and by experience and by knowledge, what it means to honor and what it means to be more sensitive to people who are sensitive to these values of honor and shame. So what does that look like? Honor and shame cultures, how you appear is a big deal. In Chinese, we have a phrase, saving face. We want to save face not just for ourselves in terms of how we appear. We don't show our weaknesses and our impurities and our negative thoughts. And we also do that in honor and deference to others. So there's that desire for harmony with one another. And that's a good thing, right? And when it comes to challenging issues like mental health, struggles with mental illness, we do that very privately and very quietly. So if we're all part of this human condition, 20 to 25% of us people struggle with mental illness every year and certainly in a lifetime. So we're not immune to that. We're not different than that, but you just don't see it. You don't hear about it. So in the Asian culture, it's not uncommon for a relative, because we're family and communal, there's always that one or two relatives that you don't hear of or know much about, because there's perhaps a chance that they are the one that is struggling with mental illness, and it is the cultural practice to hide them and say, oh, they're not feeling well, they couldn't make this family gathering. And as trust and timing works out, you might actually find out what was actually going on there. And I personally have relatives in my extended family that struggle with mental illness, but we don't know much about that because in our culture we just don't talk about it. And when we don't talk about it, it makes the challenge that much more difficult. So what are the challenges and the barriers specific to Asian American Christians and in our communities? Well, there's like a triple whammy. Asian heritage, we don't talk about it. There's a lot of shame and stigma and taboo, and the worldview of Asian cultures are shaped and passed down from generation to generation. We're in the American context where those of us that are Asian American and able to navigate both Asian culture and American culture don't feel like we belong. Third, we're in a church culture where half of churches, the statistics tell us, that mental illness, mental health is just a spiritual matter. You just need to pray harder and study the Bible more. But we know that that's not the whole picture. You're here as part of this online pastor's retreat because you are open to the idea that there's more than just a spiritual battle going on. It's not less than spiritual, but it's more than just spiritual, that we can use, and we can use the resources and tools that we have physically, emotionally, medically, relationally, to help us become more whole and to experience the abundant life that Jesus has promised. And then fourthly, we're pastors and leaders here. It is very difficult for Asian American pastors to reveal their vulnerabilities or weaknesses because of Asian culture's respect for titles and positions and hierarchy. The expectation is that the pastor is closer to God, it has more of God's resources, and therefore does not have weaknesses. Even though that's not a realistic picture, that is a cultural expectation. And it takes a lot of effort and time for a pastoral leader to begin to change that. So 4 reasons it's really hard to address the issue of mental health in Asian American Christian communities. Add to that, there's a lack of representation because it's undervalued in Asian cultures. Asian Americans don't pursue fields like psychiatry and psychology. And therefore, because of language barriers, then the immigrant Asians don't have access to mental health and those resources that are needed to better manage our stress and anxiety and depression and mental illnesses that we all have in our human condition. And for Asian minded people, they prefer alternative treatments rather than mind-altering drugs that you might be quote-unquote addicted to, or things like talk therapy. Why would you talk about your problems to a stranger? That just does not make sense to the Asian mind. And so for me, having learned how to manage my own mental health to be healthier, having had a few opportunities over the years to share my story, I found the support and the faith and the courage to share my story more openly. And I found that was really helpful to people. 2 years ago, I found a friend on Facebook to launch a podcast called Erasing Shame. And if indeed, and I believe it does, if shame festers in silence, then the opposite is honest and healthy conversation. So we started this podcast. Every week we would talk about different aspects of shame, moving it from the professional to the personal. There's a lot of resources that are developed by experts, and that's great, and that's much needed, but there doesn't seem to be as much on the personal level that people could relate to. And I know if there was a resource like that for me, not just these books with a lot of medical terms that were hard to understand, or examples and stories of people that have these outrageous symptoms when they struggle with bipolar disorder, and something a little more normative, that would have helped me persevere with less effort, if I could say it that way, if I had a resource like that. So I designed this podcast, Erasing Shame, and we had a picture in mind of that person, that young Asian American who's alone in their bedroom. They can't talk to their parents. They don't know where to turn. They don't think they have any friends, but they are probably on social media. And we wanted to present stories and conversations of honesty, of erasing shame, and give them just enough hope that they would take the next step to getting help for themselves. And we've heard a number of stories where that's been helpful. We do address mental health as we talk about erasing shame. And here's some of the things that we learned as we finish our time together. So shame goes beyond mental health. Shame literally is the silent killer. If we are able to move the needle on the suicide rate here in America and in Asia, that would be huge. If we're able to help people address their mental health in more hopeful ways, or even just taking that first step, that would be powerful. When we come out of hiding, we give hope to others. There's such a power in sharing our story, our struggles, our imperfections, and our weaknesses. And we created this platform where it's not just the experts talking, it's everyday people talking about life so that others can relate. When you hear someone who looks like you, who has some similar experiences as you, it really helps you to know that you are not alone. It's okay to get help. We normalize the overcoming that hurdle, that it's not okay to help. It's shameful. It's taboo, whatever you call it. But none of us are vulnerable. Life is challenging. It's becoming more challenging as we're in this time that we're in the midst of. None of us are Superman. Even Superman was vulnerable, right? And so one of our most popular episodes was titled "The Pressure to Be Perfect." Over 10,000 views in just a month. Again, this podcast is such a grassroots effort. We have no budget, no staff, and using some of my technological background, we just found a way to produce these podcasts because the message needed to get out. And perfectionism is a struggle of mine as well. So I have second and third and fourth thoughts about how well prepared do I need to be to give you this talk. And I just need a set deadline, get what I had prepared, and do it. And so here's my talk, sharing with you about things that I've learned about erasing shame, about mental health in Asian American communities. And I believe that many of these characteristics and learnings could be helpful to you, as I've shared with some of my Latino and African American, German friends, that yes, shame is such an issue. Mental health is such an under-addressed issue in all of our societies. Let's learn from one another. Let's tackle it together. And then lastly, we learned a lot about family matters when it comes to mental health. And you know how family matters are just complicated. So enough said there. So in closing, what can we do about all of this? What can I share with you in terms of takeaways? Well, number one, take good care of yourself. You've heard leadership is about leading yourself first. So take good care of yourself. Don't wait for a personal crisis before you get help for your mental health. Now, help doesn't have to be help. Help can be just an annual checkup. Just as you do an annual checkup for your body, do an annual checkup for your mind. Your mind is the heart, literally, it's the heart, it's the central processing unit, the CPU, the brains of how everything else works in your life, including your spiritual life. So you need a clear and healthy mind to be at your best spiritually, physically, and effective for your to go from surviving to thriving for yourself and for the community that you desire to serve and to be faithful to. So schedule a time privately, discreetly for yourself with a counselor that you already perhaps refer people to. One of the first things that you've probably done as a church leader is find a support network of Christian counselors that you can refer people to, because you know probably 20% or more of your own congregation have times where they struggle with relational issues or emotional issues which are connected to mental health issues, and they seek you for help. Clergy are often the first person that people go to when they need help for their mental health. And you might do a few sessions with them and then you refer them to a Christian counselor. Do that for yourself. One of the things that I've had to learn is to breathe more deeply and to sleep more comfortably. Those two things will anchor your path along with the other steps of managing your mental health. Managing your stress and your personal care is all the more vital in times like we're living in. Number 2, care and support for your staff and key volunteers and leaders, because talking about mental health is really just a part of our humanity, and you want to give people a more holistic picture of what it means to be living well in obedience to Christ, spiritually and also in physical ways, in financial ways, and in mental, emotional, and financial ways. Talk about all aspects of life, because people are concerned about all aspects of life. And I believe, as you would believe, the Bible has the answer to all of that, and we need to speak to that. Make mental health a safe topic to talk about. Many churches are not talking about it enough. I know you're watching, you're connecting with this online pastors retreat, so you're very open to that. So I'm just adding more encouragement for you to do that. Provide a safe place where people can have these conversations, not just in your office, but begin to create a space. Start by creating a space for just a very simple, just a weekly or perhaps a monthly. If you aren't able to get people in place to do it weekly, do it monthly. A prayer time specifically for mental and emotional well-being. I know for me, when I was going through a really challenging transition 3 years ago, after my own psychotic episode with my bipolar disorder, that having a support group at my church, I happen to go to Saddleback Church, that to be in a room with others who were also struggling with mental health really allowed me to let my emotional guard down and to realize I was not alone, and to also hear the stories of others who were journeying and still living by faith encouraged me to have a little more emotional and spiritual strength to press on for another week or for another month. So very, very valuable, and that is the unique thing that churches can offer to people who struggle with mental health. The talk therapy can only do so much, the medication can only do so much, but the church provides that community and provides that spiritual support. And then lastly, provide care and support for your church and community. I mentioned the support group. But if you would provide mental health ministry for your community, you have just opened the door for huge potential of ministry. It is the most underaddressed and the biggest opportunity of felt needs. More than 20% of people in your community are struggling with mental health and they don't know where to turn. Insurance doesn't pay enough for the healthcare costs, and as Asian Americans, they're reluctant to get professional help. But if a church would present that opportunity for support and care in a spiritual and personal way, you will have more ministry than you know what to do with. And that is what we're about, right? And so I'll close with this quote that helped me through the recovery period that I just experienced 3 years ago. That you're not alone. It's okay to get help, and there's hope. Lord bless you as you take the next steps for your own well-being and your own health during this online pastor's retreat.